for the gifts that we have to give, and for this community which truly seeks to live out its covenant that love is the spirit of this church and service is its law. May we be grateful. This is an old Cherokee tale which goes by many names, and the version that I'm telling is from the website firstpeople.us. An old grandfather said to his grandson, who had come to him with anger at a friend who had done him an injustice. The grandfather said, "I too have felt hate for those who take so much with no sorrow for what they do. I have struggled with these feelings many times." The grandfather continued, "It is as if there are two wolves inside of me. One is good and does no harm. He lives in harmony with all around him, and he does not take offense where none was intended. But the other wolf, he is full of anger. The littlest thing will set him off in a fit of temper. He fights everyone all the time for no reason. He cannot think because his anger and his hate are so great. It is helpless anger because it changes nothing. Sometimes it is hard to live with these two wolves inside of me because both of them try to dominate my spirit." And the boy looked intently into his grandfather's eyes and he said, "Which one wins, grandfather?" And the grandfather smiled and said, "The one that I feed." So this summer we have been reviewing the 6 sources of what we call our living tradition of Unitarian Universalism. The first source was direct experience of transcending wonder. The second source was words and deeds of prophetic people. Third source is wisdom from the world's religious traditions. The fourth source was Judeo-Christian teachings that call us to love our neighbor. And the fifth source was humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and science. So that brings us today to our 6th and final source, which is spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. So we'll read that again. Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. Now, if you happen to have one of our gray hymnals handy, and you open it up and you flip a few pages in past the preface and the title page, you'll see there is a page with our 7 principles and our sources listed. It begins at the top, "We, the members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote," followed by our 7 principles. And then below the principles it says, "The living tradition we share draws from many sources," and it lists the sources. And if you scan down the list, you'll notice that our 6th source, spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions, is not there. There are only 5 sources in our gray hymnal, and that is because the gray hymnal, which is called Singing the Living Tradition, was published in 1993. And the 6th source was not recognized in 1993. It was adopted at General Assembly in Spokane, Washington in 1995. So to see that source, you have to turn to our teal hymnal, which was published 10 years later. So when we talk about our living tradition of Unitarian Universalism, we really do mean a living tradition. Our 7 principles themselves were adopted in their present form only in 1985. And our 6th principle then is even 10 years younger than that. So our understanding of who we are has been constantly changing and growing over the course of several hundred years of our history. It is in our DNA to embrace new vehicles of truth and wisdom as we encounter them, and to embrace new practices that embody that wisdom in our religious life. At the same time, the deep themes of Unitarian Universalism, the spiritual and religious ideas to which we are constantly returning, and in which color our understanding of the world and our way of being in it, these themes have been with us also since the beginning. And a deeply felt connection to nature is certainly one of those themes. Ralph Waldo Emerson published an essay called Nature in 1836. in which he suggested that the divine was best encountered alone in nature, and that nature itself was a manifestation of what he called the universal spirit. He wrote, "I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, which nature cannot repair." This essay inspired Henry David Thoreau's famous experiment of living alone for a year on Walden Pond, which he wrote about in the work of the same name. Of more a recent vintage would be the work of Rachel Carson, a biologist, a conservationist, and a Unitarian Universalist. Carson's scientific work was grounded in her deep spiritual connection to nature. She actually got her first success as a writer of popular science books about the sea. And these were enormously successful precisely because she wrote with such poetry and with such deep feeling. In 1968, however, it was her work Silent Spring, which is credited with launching the modern environmentalist movement. This was a book about the devastation that was wrought in the ecosystem by the overuse of DDT and other pesticides. And it is credited with the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. So within Unitarian Universalism, the humanist confidence in science, which dominated UU thinking throughout the 20th century, was being increasingly tempered towards the end of the century by a growing awareness that science without wisdom has the potential to transform our earth in unforeseen and potentially devastating ways. Our famous optimism, our belief in the memorable words of one of our great 19th century ministers, our belief in the progress of mankind onward and upward forever, was running up against our new understanding that progress can have terrible, unsustainable costs when it places us out of harmony with the environment and when it disrupts natural cycles upon which we are totally dependent. Now, in the 70s, this growing ecological consciousness found fertile ground in a variety of other emerging movements, which included feminist theology, goddess spirituality, neo-paganism, and a growing interest in indigenous traditions. So here is the UU pagan author Starhawk, who provided us our opening words today, writing about goddess religion in her 1979 work, The Spiral Dance, which became sort of the classic work of pagan and eco-feminist spirituality. She wrote, "The three core principles of goddess religion are immanence, interconnection, and community. Immanence means that we are each a manifestation of the living being of the earth, that nature, culture, and life in all of their diversity are sacred. Immanence calls us to live our spirituality here in the world, to take action to preserve life of the earth with integrity and responsibility. Interconnection," she continues, "is the understanding that all being is interrelated, that we are linked with all the cosmos as parts of one living organism. And so what affects one of us affects us all. Interconnection demands from us compassion, the ability to feel for others so strongly that our own capacity for justice is itself aroused. And goddess religion is lived in community. Its primary goal is not individual salvation, but the growth and transformation that comes through intimate interactions and shared struggles." So that is Starhawk in 1979. And immanence and interconnection and community, the sacredness of life, the need to take action to protect our earth, these are core values of Unitarian Universalism. So these emerging movements had a strong resonance with UU belief that has existed for hundreds of years. But the language and the practices and the symbols of paganism and goddess worship were pretty far from standard UU worship practice at the time, this being the 60s and the 70s. Or, in our time, much of the time, Unitarian Universalist worship, rooted as it is in Protestantism and scientific humanism, tends to favor the intellectual, the abstract, and the rationalistic. I'm sure you are shocked to hear me say this. But it was even more so in the 60s and 70s. There were Unitarian fellowships, for example, that did not have hymns in their services because that was too churchy. So you would come to church, you would have some announcements, you would have a sermon, you would discuss it. You would go home. So there was within some UUs at that time a hunger for a worship life that was more embodied, more emotionally open, and that spoke as much with story and poetry and sacred symbolism as it did with a lecture followed by a rational dissection of that lecture. There was a hunger for worship that could draw lines of sacred connection between our spirit and our body and our earth. Now, this tension is actually also a part of our tradition, right? Going back to Emerson, the same Emerson who wrote his Paean to Nature in 1836, was already complaining in 1836 about corpse-cold Unitarian worship, back when Unitarian worship itself was practically still an infant. So the first recorded pagan ceremony that functioned also as UU worship happened in 1980 in East Lansing, Michigan. Shout out to the Midwest. In 1980 at a UU Continental Feminist Theology Convocation. Just rolls off the tongue. Feminist Theology Convocation. There were mostly women in attendance. And UU women at this time had opened up a denomination-wide conversation about a patriarchal language. For example, the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. And this conversation that they started about how we talk about our religion actually eventually led to the writing and the adoption of the 7 principles. That was started by feminists in the 70s. And at the same time, these feminists were innovating our worship. The first water communion ceremony was created at this East Lansing, Michigan convocation. If you've never heard of that, the water communion is a sharing ceremony that today is held at UU churches all over the country, typically in August to kick off the new church year. And it is a time when people come and they bring water that is symbolic of their life during the summer. And it is all poured together in a common vessel that is then used for rituals throughout the year. And we will be doing that here at UUI on August 13th. And like most things in Unitarian Universalism, no one decided that we were all going to do this. It didn't come from the top down. A group of women in Michigan who felt a need for more embodied symbolic worship came up with this thing, and other people saw it and they said, yeah, I need that. And then other people heard about it, and so it just spread. Now, in the general assemblies that followed this Michigan convocation, there was increased visibility for pagan styles of worship. It was meeting a need. And there was increased demand for worship that emphasized our connection to the earth and that acknowledged the need for human beings to live in balance and harmony. And so when the 7 principles were adopted in 1985, this concern was captured in our 7th principle. We affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. This 7th principle expresses a profound spiritual and religious truth, perhaps our most profound, and it calls us to the deepest of commitments to life, perhaps our deepest commitments. And it has had a home within Unitarian Universalism going back to our beginning, but it had never really been recognized and this explicitly formalized until the adoption of this 7th principle. And while the new eco-consciousness and the influence of goddess theory and paganism and feminism definitely played a role in us adopting this 7th principle, that role was not explicitly acknowledged in the sources. However, this influence is all over the new hymnal that was published in 1993, our gray hymnal. If you look at Singing the Living Tradition, there are multiple readings by prominent pagan authors like Starhawk. There are prayers by ecologically minded poets like the great Wendell Berry or Nancy Woods, who provided us with our Joys and Sorrows poem. There are prayers to the 4 directions. There are songs to the earth. And there are many writings and prayers of America's indigenous people, one of which was a reading for today. So this was already moving deeply into our worship practices. And so finally in 1995 at a General Assembly in Spokane, Washington, we adopted our 6th source, acknowledging what was already evident in what we did, that our living tradition drew from and draws from spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. And we are only better for the introduction of these elements to our faith. We are a richer, deeper, more powerful community. Now, with that said, I do want to introduce a note of reservation about our sixth source, specifically as it relates to the spiritual practices of native people. Now, there are, of course, UUs with native heritage for whom these are authentic personal practices, and they bring their whole spirit into this community when they come here. But for UUs who are not native, it is extremely important to be respectful and mindful in how we approach these traditions. Because the history, of course, of non-native suppression and appropriation of native culture is long and horrible. And so we need to tread very lightly here. And sometimes in the guise of admiring native spirituality, we propagate these sort of cheap and ready stereotypes about native people, which is another kind of harm. And there's an example in our gray hymnal. There's a reading, number 550, called "Earth, Teach Me," which is taken from a famous speech which is attributed to Chief Seattle. And it includes the line, "This we know, the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth." And it is a lovely sentiment, but the problem is that Chief Seattle didn't say that. Right? A white screenwriter made that line up and inserted it into the speech for a documentary that was made that has long since vanished from the earth. And in fact, the entire speech is very problematically attributed to Chief Seattle. What he said, if anything, was probably nothing like the words that are normally attributed to him. And he certainly didn't say the line that was written by the white screenwriter. But some environmentalists liked the line, and so they put it on a poster. And they said, "From Chief Seattle," because that sounds good. And then it ended up in our UU hymnal. So we need to be very careful about our approach to these texts. And the two wolves story that I opened up with today is another interesting case. This is a story that pops up regularly all over the internet. It's used by Unitarian Universalists all the time. And it is presented as a Cherokee tale, but really without any supporting attribution. So it is very unclear whether this is in fact a native story. Some versions of it incorporate Western elements that have nothing to do with native traditions. They make the good wolf white and the bad wolf black. That is not native symbology. Some researchers have traced the origin of this story actually back to Billy Graham, who told a version of it in 1978 involving two dogs, only when he told it, it was an Inuit story. So that would make its native origins obviously wholly fictional. On the other hand, there is at least one person who claims, no, I did hear that story growing up as a child from my Cherokee teachers in schools. So its provenance as a Cherokee story is a little like this. But it is sometimes presented wholly as though this is a Cherokee story, and there's no question about that. So we need to be careful how we approach these texts, as I said. Now that said, I chose to open with the two wolf story because it does potently symbolize a battle that is going on, not inside of us necessarily, but in the world and in our culture. And that is a battle between a market-driven consumer culture that is disastrously out of harmony with the rhythms of nature, which is indeed pushing us towards ecological collapse, and with a new way of being that must emerge if we are to survive as a species, a way of being that puts us back in harmony with the rhythms of nature. We are trapped right now on a path that dishonors the sacred circle of life. For we are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. But in the world that we are leaving to our own grandchildren and to their grandchildren, what room will there be for dreaming? They will need plenty of prayers. Of that, we can be certain. We can read the signs in the rising temperatures, in the melting ice, in coral reefs bleached white and dying, in drought and vanishing topsoil, in the disappearance of species and the spread of disease. We know what wolf we are feeding. And we know that in the end, that wolf will devour us. And so we pray, "Earth, teach me courage, for we will need plenty of courage in the days that are ahead of us." And we say, earth, teach me caring. Let my caring be for those who will come after me. Let my dedication to the sacred circle of life, following life, be my fuel and my inspiration. And we pray, earth, teach me renewal, because it is not too late. We can renew our hearts, and we can renew our culture, and we can renew our sacred promise to be protectors of life and to cherish our earth. There's a prayer from the Ojibwe people that says, Grandfather, look at our brokenness. We know that in all creation, only the human family has strayed from the sacred way. We know that we are the ones who are divided, and we are the ones who must come back together to walk in the sacred way. Grandfather, Sacred One, teach us love, compassion, and honor, that we may heal the earth and heal each other. As Unitarian Universalists, deeply rooted in our love for the sacred circle and in our respect for our earth, may our faith and our principles be part of this healing and part of this renewal and part of this return to a path of sacred trust. With respect for the circle of life, with determination to find a new way of living in harmony with nature, may ours be a faith that settles deep in the earth, rising green to bring a new day. Would you please rise and body your spirit for our closing hymn, number 1068, Rising Green.